Our primary mission here at Alternate Media is to bridge the gap between Judaism and Christianity, as it's existed for far too long. Yeshua, as we know, never intended to start a new religion. He was a religious Jew.
I think it's a certain point in every believer's life where we think, isn't there more?
There has definitely been a need within the church. That's something that a lot of Christians are searching for. A lot of Christians know that there is something missing in their faith. And what indeed is intended to fill that is Judaic roots of the faith.
The New Testament is very clear about bridging the gap between Jew and Gentile, and we're just returning that mission back to the modern day.
Hello and welcome everyone to another Alternate Media Live event. We'll be doing an interview again tonight, and I've got a very special guest for everyone. So without further ado, let me go ahead and bring him up. Mr. David Wilber, how are you this evening?
Hey, it's great to be with you, man. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you for being here. So before we get started and everything, go ahead and introduce yourself. And there's one more thing we got to get to after that before we start.
All right. Well, yeah, I'm David Wilber. I'm an author, Bible teacher, a Christian apologist. I focus a lot on a lot of the same things that you focus on. With the intro said, bringing. Sorry if you hear thumping. That is my son kicking the wall. So, but anyway. That's a little distracting. So I'm speaking of my son. I have two kids, Aaliyah and Ezra, and I'm married. Been married for 8 years, and I focus a lot on Torah Apologetics, why the Torah is still relevant, seeing the original Christians within the Judaism of their day, and trying to reclaim those Jewish roots of the Christian faith. That's me in a nutshell.
Awesome. So we have a tradition here on this show where we sample some fine drink. So what do you have with you tonight?
Well, I have it's called a Maximator. There's a little picture of the Pope on there. It's a Bach. I don't usually like Bachs, but yeah, this one's pretty tasty. There's a place down the street that has it brought in. But yeah, it's dark, it's tasty, and it's a good evening beer for sure. What about you?
I am doing a Kentucky Bourbon Barrel Imperial Milk Stout.
That sounds delicious. I
saw it and I was like, all right, I've not tried that. I've tried their regular stout, but not the milk one. And I'm like, all right, well, I got to try that tonight then. So that out of the way.
Man, yeah, you got me thinking about beers now. I'm like, milk stouts and big fan of stouts and porters for sure. But
love a good stouts especially. Porter's not a big shandy fan, but I'm a big. So this may be the basic bro in me, but I'm a big IPA fan.
Yeah, I'll have an IPA on occasion. But yeah, if it's not a stout or porter, like an ale, sometimes a lager. But yeah,
absolutely. So I usually like to begin by asking, background. So, how did you come to faith? What's your story that led you up to kind of where you are now?
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I grew up Lutheran. And so I was confirmed as a Lutheran when I was in middle school. That's where I was catechized and learned the basics, if you will. When I reached high school, though, I was brought to a youth group at a Baptist church. And that's when I really came to know the Lord. In my Lutheran church, it was it was just kind of, I went there because my family made me. But my experience at the Baptist church in high school, that's where I really made my faith my own. That's where I really desired to know the Lord, and where I was saved. So that's pretty much my background. Growing up Lutheran, saved in a Baptist church in high school, and I was invited to the youth group by a friend, and faith has been part of my life ever since then.
Absolutely. How did you find yourself in or on the path of Torah?
So I've always really been into Christian apologetics. I've always been into debating and theology. That's just I've just really been interested in studying the Bible from the time I got saved. And I was it was actually a Jehovah's Witness is what kind of started that trajectory for me. Because I studied Christian apologetics while I was at the Baptist youth group, and kind of fell away for a little bit after high school. And then I started getting back into things. The church that I belonged to when I was in high school, they dissolved. So when I was starting to get back into my faith and apologetics and things like that, a Jehovah's Witness knocked on my door. And for some reason, that just ignited that passion within me again. Really, my passion to argue, because here's this Jehovah's Witness trying to teach me, his doctrine and everything, and I didn't know much about Jehovah's Witnesses at that time. All I knew was that they were wrong, because that's what I grew up learning. So I scheduled a meeting with him the following week, and I decided, okay, this next week I'm going to dedicate time to studying everything I can about Jehovah's Witnesses so that I can meet this guy next week and debate him. And so that's what I did. And I remembered a friend that I had in the youth group that I went to, who was also really into apologetics. And I decided we kind of lost touch, but I decided to reach out to him, see if he had any pointers and could recommend some resources and things like that. And when I reached out to him, he was already into some messianic stuff. So he was already into the Torah by that time. And he invited me to a Bible study that he was hosting. And so I decided to go. And that was when I first heard about this concept of the law not being done away with. It was at this Bible study that he was leading. And I was blown away. Everything just clicked and made so much sense because before that time, I've always had questions. I've always wondered about things like the fourth commandment. We as Christians, we say the 10 commandments are important. We protest, if there's like a monument to the 10 commandments that are being removed from some property, Christians will show up and will protest that. And we'll say, no, the 10 commandments must stay, right? And yet the fourth commandment is not really that important or relevant. Right. No one really ever talks about it. And so I've always just kind of been curious about that. And I've always been curious about the Jewish people. It's like, so the Jewish people were like God's chosen people in the Old Testament, and but now Christians are the God's chosen people. And how did that happen? And why did that change? And so I've always had questions like that. I was always really into theology and studying, and those were things that there was a disconnect with what I was hearing in church, and I just never really thought to question it until the questions were actually raised, and I heard, I heard another perspective. I heard, there is another perspective on these issues, and it's a perspective that actually makes a lot of sense, and it's consistent. And so that's in a nutshell, that's kind of what started that trajectory for me.
Fantastic. That's quite a story. That truly is awesome though. So I understand that you are an educator with or for 119 Ministries. How did that come about?
So yeah, I'm a teacher there and a researcher. I think I've been with them since working. I think I've worked with them since 2018. That might be right. I think that sounds right. Yeah, the very beginning of 2018, I think. Yeah, I've known John Sherman for a long time. He's one of the teachers there. I've known him. Yeah, I've met him probably like a year after I got into Torah observance and messianic stuff. He actually started attending that same Bible study that I was going to, and so I met him. I've known him for a long time, and yeah, we just kind of got reacquainted because in Missouri, where I was living at the time, we had launched a new church, and I was leading. I was one of the leaders at this new church that we launched, and one of the members of 119 Ministries, Josh, he's our graphics guy and does all of the video stuff. He was attending that church, and so he and I got reconnected, and we were talking a lot. And there was an opening at 119 Ministries for a researcher, because I think at that time John was like the only teacher at the time, because they had a guy working there before that time, but he left and started doing his own thing. And so John just wanted more teachers to get plugged in and to be part of what they were doing there. And so, yeah, my friend Josh just brought it up and said, "Hey, would you be interested in being a teacher and researcher for 119?" And I said, "Yeah." And so I ended up having a meeting with John, and he and I, really hit it off. And he asked me to come on board, and so the rest is history. So been part of them ever since. I was working part-time or as a contractor for, I think, about a couple of years before I got brought on full time, and yeah,
That is awesome.
Yeah.
So one of the topics which we've talked around it a lot already, but one of the titles for what we practice and our position is pronomianism. So what exactly is pronomianism?
So yeah, this is kind of a newer label that I guess has been sort of repopularized in recent years, or popularized in recent years. People like Greg Bonson, I think, used to use this term as well. But like, it's if you are familiar with antinomianism. Pronomianism is essentially the opposite of antinomianism. So antinomianism literally means anti-law. And pronomianism, go figure, means pro-law. It's you're in favor of the law, and it's not been done away with. It's not a bad thing. It's actually a blessing and a gift. And so if I could describe pronomianism, I would say that it is a doctrine that the law is for today. The law is relevant for today. It informs how we ought to live as followers of Christ, and that's essentially it. It's the opposite of what I would consider the false doctrine, which is antinomianism. It's the true doctrine of the role of the law in our lives. So,
absolutely. So the Messiah Matters podcast, and we were actually talking about this individual earlier, Caleb Hegg. So son of Tim Hegg, love Tim Hegg. I have been following Tim Hegg and reading his books for a long time. So his son is the host of Messiah Matters, and listening to that one time, he addressed this topic, and he, from what I understood, made an argument that it's not appropriate to call normative Christians antinomian, because essentially his argument, as I understood it, was that since they accept that some of the commandments apply, that they don't qualify as antinomian, that they would still by definition be pronomian. How would you respond to that?
So I'm a good friend with Caleb Haig. I've known him for several years, and he's a great guy. And of course, his dad Tim Haig is one of my heroes. He's a wonderful scholar, theologian. But yeah, I would probably agree with much of what he said, and disagree. So in my opinion, the great thing about the word pronomianism is that it is really inclusive of people from all types of different traditions. So in addition to being pronomian, I'm going to kind of preface my answer to your question with some of this other stuff I'm saying. So
Sure.
so the name pronomianism, it encompasses pretty much anyone who affirms the law. So you could be a Baptist, and you could be a pronomian Baptist. And that's what I really like about the term, because you don't have to join a Messianic synagogue or anything like that. You know, if, like, for all intents and purposes, you could be a completely traditional, Orthodox Christian, and you come to find out, oh, the Sabbath still applies, and you could still keep going to your Baptist church and start keeping the Sabbath on the seventh day. And that's why I really like the term, is because it kind of, I think it makes it easier to transition into this way of life of upholding God's law and everything. Even though I would identify as Messianic, I attend a local Messianic church, and that's my tradition. I'm also pronomian, and so Messianics and Baptists, or whoever else, non-denominations, as long as we believe that the law of God is relevant, that it applies to us, that it informs how we ought to live, we're all pronomian. And so that's kind of the beauty of the term, and I think that's why the term has been so attractive to many people, including Caleb and others. And so the idea, I think what Caleb is trying to get at is he doesn't want pronomianism to, he wants it to be able to broadly apply to as many people as possible that would affirm God's law, and he doesn't want it to be like I hope I'm representing his motivation correctly. I may not be, but I think that's kind of what he's thinking. He wants to be able to say that people like Jeff Durbin or R.C. Sproul, people who speak very highly about the law and all of that, the moral law, at least what they would call it.
Right.
He wants to be able to say that they're pronomian. And so I think he has a point. I think that we could maybe say that pronomianism is a spectrum. And you have people who are, in my opinion, consistent pronomians, who would be more along the lines of where you and I are, where we're actually keeping the Sabbath, where we're eating clean, or keeping the festivals and things like that. And then you have, pronomian proper, if you will. And then you have people that uphold the law. They believe the law is a good thing. They're not antinomian. They're not anti-law. And they do agree that God's law is good, but there's just some differences in how it applies and which parts of it are relevant today. How are those parts relevant, and things like that. So I think Caleb has a point in that way. I would say that the classic definition of antinomianism is the belief that the law of God, as we have it in the Old Testament, is irrelevant today. That is the classic definition of antinomianism. So if you are a dispensationalist and you say that, well, we don't keep we don't keep the Old Testament law, but we keep the law of Christ. We keep like the Old Testament law has been done away with, or that's just for Israel and it only applied to them. The law of Christ, whatever that is, they never have a definition, but the law of Christ is in the New Testament. That's the law that we keep. Well, I would still classify those people as antinomian because antinomianism, by definition, relates to what we would, what people call Old Testament law. That's the topic of it, and so by definition, those people would be antinomian, even though they keep what they believe to be the law of Christ, which they think overlaps with the Old Testament law, even though it's not the same in their mind.
Right.
I would say technically that would be antinomian theology, even though their belief. I know I'm rambling now. Even though their belief that that they're in the law of Christ, manifests in obedience to the law of God, in their theology, in their thinking, they're still antinomian, if that makes sense.
Right. Yeah. No, I definitely can see that. And so it's interesting to think that there actually is that even that spectrum or division within Christendom, the non-observant Christendom, because I definitely see what you're saying regarding Caleb Hegg's point. The term pronomian, I think I can agree that it actually should be a more unifying factor. Whereas where you have the more supersessionist, dispensationalist ideologies, that is very clearly a very antinomian position, because it positions itself directly against Old Testament law in favor of, like you said, some other theoretical thing they call the law of Christ. So what is the general reaction that you get from fellow Christians when they find out that you are pronomian or that you are observant?
I've gotten all kinds of reactions. So let's see, I'm 36 now. I started getting into this when I was 20. So 2021. So yeah, I've had all kinds of reactions from one extreme to the other. People that have been very hostile, but also people that have been curious about it. Like, oh, that's interesting. I will say this, definitely. In later years, like in more recent times, in more recent years, positive responses of just curiosity or questions about why I do things, that is far more common than people immediately being hostile, and people being hostile toward me for my stance. That seems to have occurred much more often very early on when I was in this walk. And I don't know why that is. I don't know if it's something about the way that I approach the topic with other people, if that has changed and matured. I know it has. But I also wonder if there is like a general shift within the church at large. I think more recently you have people that the perspective is kind of changing in the church at large, and people are becoming more positive. I mean, you have Baptist churches, they're just my go-to denomination to use, but like you have Baptist churches that will put on Passover seders, for example, and even though they don't believe that you have to do Passover, they don't believe that it's something you have to do as a Christian. It's not required. They'll still do Passover. They'll have a Seder every year, even, because they see value in it. They see how Messiah is, that it symbolizes Messiah, that it represents his work and what he's done for us. And so they see the value in it. So they can't look at it as like some bad thing or something that's going to put you in bondage. It's a good thing. And so I think there is like I've been saying, repeating myself now, but I think there is sort of like a general shift, at least in my experience. That's kind of, what has that been like for you? Have you kind of noticed in recent years some of a more of a general shift in a positive direction or a positive disposition toward the law?
In my personal experience, I've actually noticed the reactions that I receive, I've noticed actually have gone from being more of a wide spectrum to being completely binary. And that is to say that it's either one extreme or the other, and it's instantly. So, whenever someone finds out, or if I make mention of my practice, or if they see me doing something that and observe the practice themselves, there is either immediate curiosity and interest or immediate disdain. And it's one of those two. But I will say that I have noticed generally more interest in recent days, and I think that I can agree. I think that there is a growing desire and curiosity towards this lifestyle that from within the church. I guess you could say an awakening, so to speak. I definitely do think that I can say that I have observed that in my own personal life.
Awesome.
But so speaking of that and these experiences, what are some of the most common arguments that you hear from antinomians?
Well, I mean, anyone who's not familiar with this perspective, this way of life, is going to have the same questions, whether it's like from an antagonistic, disposition or posture, or just curious. It's so different from what they've learned growing up, right? And so a lot of people are going to have the same questions. But yeah, like antinomian arguments, I would say that the harshest critics come from like the dispensationalist camp, and the that kind of thinking, because they already have like a systematic theology where they've compartmentalized where all of these aspects of the Bible belong. And so if you go outside of those compartments that they contrived, it's like cognitive dissonance. And so they're like, so I think it just really, I often hear like, well, that's the Old Testament. Jesus and the apostles, they said those things aren't required anymore, that you don't have to do those things anymore. Jesus fulfilled the law, which in their opinion means that he fulfilled the prophetic predictions, he filled the typology and all of that, and somehow in so doing, he made those practically irrelevant. And so that those you have like a lot of just, what's the word, like buzz phrases. You have a lot of buzz phrases that people go to, like Jesus fulfilled the law.
Read Galatians.
Yeah, read Galatians. Jesus fulfilled the law, and so you hear something like Jesus fulfilled the law. Well, like that's like almost all of them say that, right? Jesus fulfilled the law, and it's like, well, what do you mean by that? Like, what does that actually mean, that Jesus fulfilled the law? And most people, like I'm sad to say, most people have never really thought through it. It's just a buzz phrase. It's something that they've heard in church or wherever, and because they don't want to think too hard about the. I shouldn't say that. That's probably perhaps uncharitable, but
we like to get spicy here.
But like, it's like, I think in some cases that is true. I mean, people just don't want to think too hard about it. They're just happy with a stock answer. They're like, whatever they're not familiar with, whatever they're not comfortable with, whatever is outside of their theological box, whatever they have to say to dismiss it. And so Jesus fulfilled the law. That's one of those buzz phrases that people say, that's how they can dismiss it, because in their mind that means he made it irrelevant in some way. And yeah, I'd say that's probably the most common. You also get people going, if they're familiar with the Bible and the New Testament, you have people going to Acts 15. You have people going to Acts 10 with Peter's vision,
Right.
and Mark 7 with Yeshua's Yeshua's confrontation with the Pharisees and all of that. So yeah, those are typically the places where people go, and it's I mean, since doing this since I was 20 or 21 years old, I mean, I haven't heard anything new, I think, in probably 10 years. I mean, it's always the same arguments. And so that's, yeah, Hebrews 2, like Hebrews chapter 8, 8:13. So yeah, passages like that.
It's interesting you say that, because I get that those who disagree, watching this, they hear that kind of a statement and they think that to them it probably strikes them as being very arrogant, right? But for, I think, the general majority of those of us who have been on this path for more than 10 years, I think that is generally our experience, is that after you've had a certain amount of discussions on the topic, you kind of have just heard most of what there is to hear. And I will say most because, maybe there is somebody out there who has a scripturally based argument that I've not considered before.
Sure.
But I haven't heard it yet,
It's I mean that's part of the reason why I started my blog, like quite literally, is because I get the same questions over and over again. And so it's exhausting writing out the same answers to the same questions. And so I started writing articles and doing videos so I could just throw a link at them and say, here I go, already covered it. If you have any objections after reading this or watching this, let me know. I'd be happy to talk to you more. But yeah, a lot of that, I do that, to have resources available. Also for people that already believe this, but are, have genuine questions about those passages and how to understand them from a pronomian perspective. But yeah, that was definitely one of my motivations, is just saving myself time.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and not trying to sound arrogant. It's just the way it is. I'm sure people that are passionate and have studied other biblical topics for many years feel the same way, whether that be Calvinism, Arminianism, or whatever else. So
right, I'm sure there's any number of apologists out there who have maybe had enough discussions with atheists, to have heard the majority of arguments that there are to hear out there about it. We very seldom ever find new information. Solomon said, "There's nothing new under the sun," and I'm just the more that I learn, the more I'm actually finding out that's true.
Right. I will say this, just to kind of go back to, it's the same information but presented in a new, like, scholarly way. I have to say that I've been really impressed with the direction of scholarship when it comes to this topic. Have you heard of, like, Paul within Judaism?
No.
So it's a school of thought. You have Pauline scholarship,
right?
And there are different perspectives on Paul. You have, like, the what's now called the old perspective, or the Lutheran perspective on Paul.
Right.
You have the new perspective on Paul, but like N.T. Wright and James Dunn and all of that. And now you have something that has kind of come out of the new perspective on Paul, called Paul within Judaism. And so these labels represent different schools of thought within Pauline scholarship. And there's overlap here and there between the different schools of thought. But Paul within Judaism, it basically says that, no, Paul was a Jew. He stayed a Jew. He died a Jew. He did not teach against the Torah. There's nuances and differences of opinion on how he viewed the way that Torah should apply to Gentiles and things like that. So there's there's various perspectives within Paul within Judaism
Right.
that deal with like the Gentile question when it comes to Torah observance. But Paul within Judaism, broadly speaking, is basically, yeah, Paul was pronomian. Paul was he remained a Torah observant Jew, and he did not deviate from that. And so that's kind of been the direction that I've seen. And so I've been really encouraged reading a lot of scholarly papers and books from these various scholars within this perspective. And I even started a new series on my channel called Scholars on Scripture, where I will read excerpts from their books and papers, and on my personal YouTube channel. And I'll play clips of these scholars that come from this perspective, just to kind of demonstrate to people like, hey, this isn't just like a bunch of fringe people on the internet that think they have all the answers. This is a real school of thought within Christian scholarship of scholars that are seeing these things in the text. And yeah, I think that's another reason why I think, a lot of why you see, sort of generally speaking, a more positive disposition toward the law and the church, more generally speaking, moving in that direction. I'm getting way off topic, but
no,
that's
fascinating. So it sounds like it's, I would say, a much more consistent position or outgrowth from the new perspective on Paul. That's one of the things that I never understood about a lot of scholars who do, tout and fall in line with the new perspective on Paul, is I'm familiar with it. Is I'm like, look, you guys are like right there. How are you not making that connection?
Yeah. Yeah. It did a lot to kind of emphasize the the Jewishness of the New Testament and things like that. But there was still like this disconnect, particularly when it came to the law, that trying to understand Paul and his relationship to the law. And I think the Paul within Judaism perspective is as you said, you put it well, it's more consistent. It's kind of like how I felt when I attended that Bible study for the first time. And I never even considered any other perspective. I didn't even know another perspective was out there until I heard the questions raised, and then it clicked. And it's like, oh, there is a better way to understand this issue. There is a better way to read these texts. You don't have to have an incoherent theology, and so that's that. Yeah. So I'm encouraged to see that. And I think a lot of Christian scholars are moving in that direction and seeing some of the same things. So yeah, we'll talk about my book later, but I quote a lot of them and cite them in my book too.
Absolutely. So. On this topic, in your experience, is there a particular subject of theological conversation, right? Is there a particular topic when discussing with another believer about the Bible that, in your experience, seems to just naturally lead to the discussion of pronomianism versus antinomianism?
Yeah, 100%. Well, not 100%. 95% of the time it is the Sabbath. Because think about it. It's one of the 10 commandments. Yep. Everyone agrees that the 10 commandments are important. And so it naturally raises the question, well, what about the fourth commandment? Right. And so just asking that question, it gets you to think about it. You already are coming against so much tradition and dogma that you've heard. Just asking the question gets people thinking about it, and because it is the 10 commandments are so foundational to our faith as Christians. How do you deal with that? And And like I said, that was kind of one of the questions that I had. I just never understood why the Sabbath, if it's one of the 10 commandments and everyone agrees that the 10 commandments are important, like why doesn't anyone talk about the Sabbath, or what happened to the Sabbath? So yeah, that's I think that would be 95% of the time. That's the open door right there.
Yep. I would say the same. In my experience, that is the main topic of discussion, right? That always ends up leading into a discussion about whether or not the rest of the law is relevant.
Right.
And
right. Because people, sorry to cut you off, but yeah, like people like, they just automatically associate the Sabbath with the Old Testament.
Right.
And so they already have this category in their mind that Old Testament is old. It's irrelevant. It's we're Christians. We follow the New Testament. And so automatically you're like, well, is the Old Testament irrelevant? It shouldn't be. Paul didn't think so. I mean, those were the scriptures that Jesus read and taught from, and the apostles taught from. Paul said all scripture is God breathed and profitable for teaching and instruction and reproof and training in righteousness. And you just look the verse immediately before that, he's obviously talking about the Old Testament, because he's talking about the scriptures that Timothy had and learned growing up. And so, so immediately it opens up the question of like, well, what about the rest of the Old Testament? What about the rest of the law? So yeah, I love the Sabbath. So it's
Would you say then that the Sabbath, in your experience, tends to be people's first step on the path of Torah?
I think so. In my experience, it was mine for sure. And I've seen other people that was like the first thing that they started questioning. I've also seen several people. I mean, I've been in this for many years now, but so I've seen other people get into it from the feast days too. Passover, as I mentioned earlier, is becoming much more popular in Christianity at large, and so that's kind of an open door too, because you learn that Passover is all about Jesus, and Jesus said, "Do this in remembrance of me," and this is Passover, and that's what they were doing, and that's what we're supposed to do in remembrance of him, and so that's another open door for sure, and so I'm really encouraged to see Christians from all types of backgrounds embracing Passover. I've also seen some people, because they're very health conscious, they're very into health and eating well, and that's kind of been an open door for some people, is because of that interest and desire, they start to look into like, well, are there things I should not eat? And well, the Bible actually has some opinions on that, and so yeah.
It's so funny thing. My colleague here at Alternate Media, my co-host Seamus, is when it comes to the argument that God doesn't care what I eat. One of the things that he loves to point out is that, well, technically the first sin was a violation of kosher law.
Yeah. That's what caused the fall, is eating something we shouldn't.
Right. But you did write a book specifically on the Sabbath. The book, Remember the Sabbath. I read it, was a spectacular book, particularly in the vein of defending and proving the validity of the Sabbath. What has been your reception regarding this?
Yeah, well, thank you so much for reading it and for your review, by the way. It was a real encouragement and honor for you to write that. But yeah, it's been pretty well received. It's certainly been well received within the Messianic community, the pronomian community. It's certainly been well received within those spaces. I think that people, at least from what I've heard, people have been really encouraged by it. It's really strengthened their theological beliefs in the validity of the law. It's equipped them and given them good arguments to use to support their beliefs. And so I'm really encouraged to hear that, because I definitely I've had two audiences in mind when I wrote the book. And that was one of the audiences. Is I wanted to help my peeps, right? I wanted to help people know how to defend their faith and know what they believe and why they believe it, and how to answer criticisms. And so from that audience, the reception's been really well, and from people that don't agree with me. I have heard some positive feedback as well. I don't think I've heard any negative feedback, actually, now that I'm thinking about it. There was one guy that left a 1-star review on Amazon, but he clearly did not read the book, and he's a troll, and he leaves 1-star reviews on all of my books because he hates me. So, but yeah, it's been positively received from what I've given it out to from people that don't already agree with me. I'm in school right now. I'm going to school for biblical studies.
Nice.
And so I did give my book to my systematic theology professor and my apologetics professor and my professor who teaches on the minor prophets and wisdom literature. And so I sent all of them my book, and so I'm anxious to hear if they have any feedback, because they don't already agree with me, obviously.
Absolutely.
So yeah, I'll have to let you know what they say. But
Please do.
Yeah. So yeah, it's been good. So I've been very blessed and encouraged by the response so far.
Fantastic. So you recently, after publishing the book, had a debate with Rob Solberg on the Faith Unaltered / CSG Christian Sinners Guide show. Those guys are awesome, by the way. I love those guys. I've been on their podcast before, I think twice myself. Really great guys. They're very agreeably disagreeable. They're able to peacefully disagree, and we're still brothers at the end of it. Wonderful fellas. Regarding that debate, though, what do you think? And I love asking this kind of question, because it's asking you to step into the box of your interlocutor. What do you think his strongest argument was?
Man, it is hard. I have a bias, obviously, so I'm gonna, so I'm automatically going to think none of his arguments are good, but yeah, I think probably his strongest argument is an objection to one of my arguments, and that is, Matthew 5:18 says, that not a jot or tittle will pass away from the law until heaven and earth disappears and everything is accomplished. And I interpret that as the end of the present age. Like, I interpret that as nothing's going to pass away from the Torah until basically until the kingdom fully comes to earth, and
Right.
this present age passes away, and we enter into the new heavens and new earth. Go figure, until heaven and earth pass away, right? So his strongest objection to that, I think, is just it's a spattering of verses that seem to contradict that. So because in the New Testament you have passages that seem to say that things have already passed away. Like on the surface, Like
Right.
you can see on the surface that you can understand the argument, like that. Okay, it seems like things have already passed away, and probably the strongest passage in support of that is Hebrews 8:13.
Right.
So that is it's a difficult passage. Obviously, I do not think it contradicts Matthew 5:18. I do not think that it refutes pronomianism. But the reason that it is difficult is because it's a lot to unpack in order to understand it correctly. There's just a lot of work you have to do to kind of unpack what is going on in Hebrews, the arguments that the author is making. He's writing in a genre that a lot of us as Westerners are not very familiar with. He's writing in midrashic. He's using midrashic logic, which what the heck is that all about? He's making arguments from silence all over. Like, that's not logical. What's going on here? So it's very difficult to unpack what exactly is going on, and it's a lot to explain. And so, but when you just throw it out there, like on the surface, it's a strong argument on the surface. Like if you're just throwing it out there, because on the surface, it does seem like something has passed away. He says that something is vanishing away, right? So the covenant, which the word covenant's not actually used in that verse, by the way. But anyway, I'm going on and on. But yeah, that's the strongest argument, I think.
That I gotta say, because I've watched it a few times, and naturally I have a bias, and the same bias as you, so I didn't think any of them were really good. But I respect the effort that you put into really, really diagramming, the way he framed it and presented it, because it's true, especially when considering the midrashic nature of Hebrews. I mean, when you're reading that kind of a document, you really can't isolate a verse, and this argument works if you do isolate a verse. But you can't do that. You really have to start from the beginning, because right from the beginning of this document, it's trying to frame a specific mindset for you to understand what comes after in that mindset. Things like the Tanya also are very much written that way. It begins by asking a question, and then you don't get to the answer to that question until like 13 chapters later, because it spent all of this time framing a certain mindset for you to understand that answer in. Because if it gave you that answer right away, you wouldn't get it. It's that style of writing that we're entirely too unfamiliar with in the West. But so that's awesome. What would you say your strongest argument was?
Before I get there, I want to recommend a couple things on Hebrews 8:13. Is I on my personal YouTube channel, David Wilber, I read an excerpt from a paper by Dr. Jesper Svartvik. He's a Swedish scholar, but he wrote an excellent paper on Hebrews, and I read an excerpt specifically on Hebrews 8:13, where he explains how it's not doing away with the law or the Mosaic covenant or anything like that in that verse. And so the title of the paper is Reading Hebrews Without Presupposing Supersessionism, something like that. But yeah, go to my channel and check it out. Because I think he gives a really good answer to that. But my strongest argument, and I actually, because I think this question came up in the debate, and I would agree with Rob that probably my strongest argument is just the assumed continuity regarding the Sabbath in the New Testament, is because if you just read the New Testament without any, like if you've never heard a sermon in your life, if you've never read the Bible in your life, or any, like if you never grew up in church, and if you just read the New Testament, what are you going to assume regarding the Sabbath? Jesus is keeping it. The apostles are keeping it, and Jesus is teaching how to keep it, so it would be weird to do away with something that he is teaching people how to keep. It just seems weird, right? He seems concerned in Matthew 24. He's like, pray that you won't have to flee on the Sabbath. He's like assuming, he assumes that it's important. He's just like, I really hope you guys won't have to break the Sabbath. I mean, that's kind of what he's saying there. So I think just the assumed continuity throughout the New Testament regarding the Sabbath, when you just read the narratives and what how Jesus and the apostles lived, is they kept the Sabbath. And so it's really only a few passages explicitly, that deal with the Sabbath that are debatable. Colossians 2, Romans 14, and all of that. And but yeah, everything else. And I think this also, and I came across this when I was studying and doing research for my book, is not only does the New Testament assume continuity, but almost the entire Christian world outside of Alexandria and Rome continued to keep the Sabbath as late as the 5th century AD.
Yep.
Like that was just an assumed practice. It's like, yeah, we're Christians. We keep the Sabbath. Of course we keep the Sabbath. We're Christians. That's what Jesus did. So it's and there are reasons, I think, why in Alexandria and Rome you had Christians abandoning the Sabbath earlier on. And it doesn't have anything to do with what the New Testament teaches. It has to do with a desire to disassociate from Judaism, is really the thing. I know you have a lot of opinions on that, but
yeah, definitely. I mean, we see pretty early on in Christian history that there seems to be a drive to dissociate from Judaism.
Mm-hmm. Particularly in Rome and Alexandria.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. And I think that's one of the more fascinating topics of discussion that we could probably get lost on here.
Yeah.
Oh man, there was something that you just said that it sparked something, and I wanted to ask you about it, but it's left me for now. Are there any points from that debate that you would approach from a different angle, thinking back on it?
There's really only one thing that I wish I would have done differently. Because whenever I do a debate, I've done several debates, and I over prepare big time for debates. I have an entire document with every conceivable objection that I could come up with that could be raised against my position. And when I hear my opponent raise those objections, I copy that into my Word document as I get ready for my response. Right. So I'm really into being over prepared. Every time I've done a debate, I've only used about 20% of my material that I've actually prepared for it. So, but there was one objection that Rob raised that I did not prepare for, and you can probably see it in my reaction, because I kind of stumbled over it a little bit. And I can't believe I did not prepare a response for this, but it was the question of the death penalty. And, he's like, well, you say that the Sabbath is important, that we should be keeping all the laws in the Old Testament concerning the Sabbath, but why do you keep all of the laws except for the death penalty, like the death penalty laws? And so, I mean, it was a good question, for sure. But yeah, it's, I would have had a bet. I think I handled it okay. But I feel like if I had actually been prepared for that, I would have I would have been I would have, been able to answer the question way better. Cause you could definitely see me stumbling a bit, I think at that point.
I gotcha.
So,
So I remembered what it was, because you'd mentioned that we do see a precedence of Christians observing the Sabbath all the way up into the 5th century.
mhm.
And I for my own position, I would say probably it was still maintained more in secret. Through I think there's probably been a consistent line of observance throughout history.
Oh, sure.
Maybe in a
Yeah.
very small fragment.
Mhm.
Because we did an episode on this a while back, going over different observant groups that we find throughout history.
Mhm.
People like the Waldensians. We know they were Sabbatarian. But one of the single greatest proofs that I think I've ever read in my life is actually the Alhambra Decree of 1492, right? The official expulsion of the Jews from Spain.
Mm.
Do you know what that says about why the Jews were being expelled from Spain?
No, tell me.
So it's a series of paragraphs, right?
Uh-huh.
The
Uh-huh.
first paragraph is basically nothing but introduction and titles.
Uh-huh.
The second paragraph is literally the first instance of the explanation of why we're sending the Jews out of Spain. The primary reason is because Christians were going to Jews to learn how to observe.
Wow.
That and it explains it in pretty great detail.
Man.
Says that the Jews were teaching them out of their own prayer books, giving them of their meats, showing them the observance of their Sabbaths and whatnot. Like it's a very condemning decree.
That is crazy, dude. Like, man. I recently read a paper by Dr. John Gager. The title of the paper was Jews, Christians, and the Dangerous Ones in Between. And fascinating paper. I didn't agree with all of what he said, but basically he said that you've always had these dangerous ones in between, like these and he started out the paper. It was kind of interesting because he started out the paper talking about this nun she was like in modern times recently, a nun who discovered that she was Jewish, and so she started practicing the Torah. She's like, that was part of her heritage, and so she started observing the Torah, the Sabbath, and kosher, and all of that. And it elicited condemnation from both Jewish and Christian leaders. Basically, Christian leaders saying, "Well, she's a nun. She's a Christian. She should act like a Christian." And the Jews are like, "Well, she's a Christian. She should act like a Christian." And so you had condemnation from both sides, leaders from both sides, and so much of what you have going on in the early centuries with Christianity and Judaism is you have both of these entities defining themselves in contrast to each other. They're defining their identities in contrast to each other. And then what do you do with the people that are in the middle of that? Well, they're a threat to the group identity. They're a threat to this identity that we're establishing for ourselves. And so it's so fascinating seeing that trajectory going all the way to what you were just talking about. It's like, oh, well, we can't have these Christians learning about the Torah from Jews. Right. And that's just such the parting of the ways, man. Yeah, that's a that's fascinating topic.
Oh yes, sir. Yeah, that's one that we kind of stay on here quite a bit. But sticking with the theme of debate here, since we've been discussing your debate with Rob Solberg, which, so interesting enough, before I get to the next question, believe it or not, we on our Discord page, right? We have an alternate media Discord page. We've had people on there who have actually said that they were convinced of Torah observance by watching Rob Solberg's videos.
Nice. These arguments are so bad. Like, I have to. I have to start. Man, yeah. This is the best you guys got. Yeah. Gosh, that's hilarious.
So
Oh man.
the first place I ever saw you was actually one of your debates. You had a debate with Tony Yu about Torah observance.
Mhm.
Which again, spectacular debate. I thought you hit every nail on the head there for that one. And he seemed a little unnecessarily hostile, but that comes with the territory sometimes.
Mhm.
But if you could go back to that debate, are there any points that you would have touched on differently?
I think within the parameters of the debate, I did okay. My biggest problem with that debate was that the topic was so broad. Um, should Christians keep the Torah?
Right.
That topic is so broad, and so I felt like I had to spend um, much of my opening statement just defining what do we mean by that, like what do we mean by Torah, like what do we mean by keeping Torah, and so it was so broad that I feel like there really wasn't a lot of time to unpack everything, and and so that's my main problem with that debate. I think within those parameters, I did okay. I over prepared, of course, and so I feel like I feel like I was really prepared for that debate, and so I was able to address everything pretty well. The thing I didn't like is that now that I'm remembering it, is Tony's closing statement, which he ended. So his closing statement, he brought up a whole bunch of new arguments,
Right.
and so it's like, well, I can't even respond to those, and so I ended up writing a blog responding to those arguments in his closing statement. But yeah, I just that's the yeah, that was the main thing. If I could go back, I would say like let's keep it to like a more narrow topic, like should Christians keep the dietary laws or should Christians keep the Sabbath?
Right.
Something like that's more narrow that can that we can cover more ground and all of that. So yeah.
Right. Yeah, because when you make the topic that broad, yeah, you do end up talking about the Sabbath. You end up talking about dietary laws. You end up talking
Mhm.
about the death penalty, circumcision, right? There's
Right.
so many different topics come up in that discussion when it's that broad. Matter of fact, I've had a discussion myself that it's on our YouTube because I did TikTok live and it lasted about 4 hours going around in those circles. Yeah, no, definitely. I'll definitely take that to heart myself. If I ever end up getting into another debate regarding that, it's like, all right, so which one of these do we want to talk about as a specific?
Right. I mean, yeah, it's like debating the Trinity or something. I mean, like that is such a broad topic. Like you would have to debate like did Yeshua pre-exist, or like did Yeshua something more narrow. But otherwise it's
Right,
going to be a 4-hour debate. I mean,
right.
it's just
Well,
yeah.
it's because you're debating an entire theology rather
Mhm.
than the individual points or pillars that would hold up that theology.
Mhm.
Um, Definitely. Uh, I'm given to understand that you have somewhat of a relation to somebody that we have interviewed here before.
Mhm.
So I understand that Michael Jones from Inspiring Philosophy is your brother-in-law.
Mhm. Yeah.
Curious. Have you guys ever had that conversation? The Torah conversation, the Sabbath conversation?
We have Michael's a great guy.
He is.
Yeah, we keep in contact quite a bit. We've worked on some projects together, and we share research all the time. Like every week
I can tell.
yeah, we're messing each other back and forth about various topics. So yeah, great guy, wonderful apologist. Honestly, one of my favorite Christian apologists for sure. Yeah, we've had the conversation. So he was married to my wife's. He has been married to my wife's sister for many years before I married my wife, and so we met when my wife and I were dating at the time, and so of course the topic came up then, and he had to make sure that I was right for his sister-in-law and that I wasn't some weird part of some weird cult or
good man.
Yeah. So, which, yeah, you're right. So I am pretty weird, but yeah, so we've talked about it here and there, and it's been a long time since we've talked about this topic in particular. I did send him my book. So he said he was going to read it. And so he's another one of those guys that I'm anxious to hear feedback
Absolutely.
from, to see what he thought. I also sent him my debate with Rob Solberg, and he watched my opening statement, and then he watched Rob's opening statement, and he said that Rob is very boring. And so that was his only feedback from that I heard. But
I can see him saying that with the most stern of faces.
Yeah. So so we haven't talked about it in a while. Obviously he disagrees with me. But yeah, it's that's there's not really much to say. It's similar arguments from anyone else. But he's a deep thinker for sure. I think that I wonder, I should say this. I wonder if he maybe turned off to the idea primarily because there are a lot of crazy people that are within the messianic sphere or the messianic circle of religion, whatever you want to call
the
it.
Fringies.
Yeah. So there are a lot of weird people that promote a lot of weird stuff, who also happen to think the Torah is important. And so that is something that I wonder if he kind of associates, if he kind of lumps that into some of the weird stuff that he's encountered. I wouldn't be surprised. But yeah, he doesn't think that I'm crazy or weird. He just thinks that I'm wrong about this topic. So
naturally,
yeah.
That is a question I hadn't thought about though. Man, yeah, what are some of the weird things that you've encountered in the Torah observant movement?
Oh my gosh, man, there is so much weird stuff. And I mean, it's the weird stuff is not exclusive to the Torah people. I think that the Torah movement is attractive to people who are already weird, because it is going. I've thought about this a lot. Yes. Because it is another idea that goes against the grain. It's another idea that kind of bucks the system, that kind of goes against the grain of tradition and mainstream thought. And so because that's the nature of the topic, it is attractive to people who already have those sorts of dispositions and to get into weird stuff, for better or worse. And so that's kind of the that's kind of my theory anyway. But yeah, weirdest stuff, man. I don't know. Flat Earth is pretty weird.
That's a common one that I've encountered. Would you say also, and tell me if this is your experience, right? Because I can definitely agree with what you said about it attracting a certain sort, because it naturally goes against the grain of what is established and popular.
Mm-hmm.
Do you find that it also seems to attract those who already have a bent or interest in simply knowing something that other people don't know, right? The secret knowledge aspect tickles their Gnostic fancy.
Right. Yeah, that is a really good way of putting it. I definitely see that. I think that, I mean, that's a very human thing, right? Like
Sure.
we all want to feel special. We all want to feel like we're smart and like we know something that other people don't know. And so I think that's I mean, again, that's not a mentality or sentiment that's exclusive to Torah people, but that is one of the things that makes Torah observance attractive to those kinds of people, is because it is something that's different. It is something that stands out, that, and so people who want to feel special, who want to feel like they have some kind of secret knowledge or whatever,
Right.
they gravitate toward things like Torah observance. And so, yeah, that's definitely it, among other things. So other things they gravitate toward tend to be a lot more weirder. So yeah, that's
Have you encountered anybody who has started making their own sacrifices?
yes. Yes, I have. I have
That I would say ranks pretty up there with the weird.
I have met people who believed that they needed to check to make sure the men were circumcised before participating in their Passover Seder. They said, that they have to have a checker. They have to have a checker at the door. And so that's one of the things that I've encountered, that I've heard from people. Yeah, of course you have people that want to like add books to the Bible, like Jasher and Jubilees and Enoch and all of that, and they believe Moses really wrote Jubilees and Enoch really wrote Enoch, and
well, we could have a long conversation about that.
Yeah, so there's a bunch of people that go in that direction. Yeah, I don't know, man. There's a lot of weird stuff out there. It's
certainly. Well, outside of that, to return to some sense of normality here, go ahead and plug yourself, man. Tell everybody watching right now where they can find you, where they can buy your book, which we will put a link to in the description of the video.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me, man. It was a blast. It was I love talking Bible, love talking theology. So yeah, this was a lot of fun. And by the way, I just want to say, if you are one of those weird people that I mentioned, I still love you, by the way. We can still be friends. So I hope the way that I was talking doesn't offend you or whatever. I'm weird too in some ways, so we're all weird. But yeah, so yeah, you can reach out to me at davidwilber.com. That's a Wilber. I'm not related to Paul Wilber, the Messianic worship singer. Different spelling. But yeah, davidwilber.com. And you can get my book at sabbathbook.com. And so, yeah, I wrote the book for you. Please check it out. I would, and if you do check it out, please leave a review, because I love to hear your thoughts. It's a great encouragement to me. And yeah, Brad, thank you so much for having me. It was a blast.
Absolutely, and thank you. Oh goodness! All right, I had a weird moment there. Hang on. All right.
Yeah. Right at the end.
Thank you, everybody, for watching who has been watching. Definitely hope to answer some questions, to maybe spark an interest. Definitely go visit his website. Definitely get his book. As I understand, we're probably going to add that to our book club list that we do on a monthly basis. So we will be reading through that book and discussing that book at a certain point. Remember the Sabbath by David Wilber. Spectacular book for Torah apologetics in general, but especially the Sabbath. And definitely visit our Patreon, like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video. That said, I hope that you all have a wonderful evening. Shalom. Bye.